Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein, and our guest tonight is the internationally acclaimed sculptor, Anthony Caro. For some years now, he has been widely recognized as the leading English sculptor of his generation. He is an artist of considerable influence on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a special pleasure to welcome you, Anthony Caro.
Thank you.
The sculpture that won Mr. Caro his renown since the early 60s consists of large, open, low-lying, landscape-like, abstract, welded steel constructions, the surfaces of which were often painted a single and often a vivid color. The work, however, did not always look that way. Along about 1959, a metamorphosis, if you will, took place. It was then that you stopped sculpting in an expressionist manner and started making steel constructions. You tell us, how did that conversion take place?
Well, it seemed to me that it didn't really start there at all. I started off by being by wanting to be a sculptor, very much against my parents' wishes. They wanted me to be a stockbroker, and perhaps they were right. Except I don't think I'd have been a very good stockbroker. But anyway, finally they agreed to my being a sculptor, and I went to a very academic school because what I wanted to do was just make real heads and figures and things as much like what I saw in the world as possible. And it was only after 5 years of doing very realistic work that I found, in a way, and copying a lot of things from Greek times and going through the history of art, in a way, in my own work, that I found that I wasn't really contented with that kind of almost waxwork-like imitation. And so I decided that I would like to go and work for the artist who, at that time, I felt was the sculptor at that time who I felt was most exciting me, and I felt was the source. I went to the source, and it seems to me.
You're actually condensing a great deal of history. Well, perhaps you might tell us too who that sculptor was and how you came to work for him.
Yeah, well, that was Henry Moore, and well, no, I'd like to finish in a way, your question, and we can go into the kind of social details later, but and it was only after working for Moore.
And for how long a period was that?
For a couple of years, and doing things, and even there, kind of tracing through surrealism and learning about Negro art and things which I hadn't seen at all at the academy. Whereas the academy was a school which is kind of part of the salon in England. I don't know whether you have the equivalent of that in New York, what I call the salon.
I thought actually your academic school was sort of the right wing of the art establishment
yes, right,
in England.
Very much the right wing of the art establishment. And every year they have a show, and the people who taught at the school were people who were the officials of the sort of salon.
Was that Mr. Wheeler a part
People like, yes, people like Charles Wheeler and Hardiman, Macmillan. They were the sort of people, Wheeler and Macmillan were each responsible for the fountains in Trafalgar Square, you know, with sprouting out, and the those kind of dolphins. Hardiman was responsible for the statue of Earl Haig on a horse, which is down Whitehall. These are the sort of people that were teaching us, and they taught us a great deal. I mean, they came, a different one came every term, and but in the end, I just felt that you know, their sort of art was very mannered, and it wasn't really a pure, you know, clear way into making sculpture of what I saw, what I felt, and I felt that Moore could teach me more about that than others. So eventually, I worked for 2 years for Moore, and after leaving him, I came through to making, to being influenced by Picasso bronzes, and a much more expressionist sort of work. And it was only, you know, after going through well, after finding really that those bronzes themselves weren't real. They weren't real in the sense that one was able to have a rapport with them like one could have with another person or something. That I found that I had to that I was dissatisfied with them, and I had to make certain changes, like sitting a clay figure on a seat, on a sort of on a metal base.
Some pedestal.
Not a pedestal, an actual seat, and putting the seat on the floor in order to try and make it more real. But it still was just a lump of clay. And I wasn't.
You were using lumps of
happy.
clay as bits of collage almost at one point.
Yes, I did use some lumps of clays, and I did use some stones and things in them. But I still couldn't. They had gone a little way away from the figure. They were a little more expressionist. In fact, what happened was at that time, which was 1959. Clement Greenberg came to England, and I met him at a party and coaxed him up to my studio and said, "What do you think of my work?" And in effect, he said not much, but in fact, he made me feel at the end of the day that he made me feel very much better, not worse. He made me feel there was a lot of hope, and that, you know, I simply had to start to, you know, rethink things a little bit. And in the fall of that year, I got a Ford English-speaking union travel grant, and I came to the States.
Which you had applied for before that meeting.
Which I had applied for before that meeting. Right, and the year before I hadn't got it. And the second year I got it because I knew what questions the other guy was going to ask. Well, I assumed that he was. He came up with exactly the same questions, funnily enough. He must have had a very small repertoire of questions. And as I'd actually practiced the questions with my wife. I mean, she was him and I was me, and then she corrected me and said, "No, that's not good enough, try again." Till I got them pretty good, and then in the end he came up with the identical questions. I had them absolutely spot on. So then I got the thing.
You've acknowledged actually a great deal to your encounters with American painters, especially Kenneth Noland,
yeah,
and an American critic, especially Clement Greenberg. Perhaps you might describe, after that meeting at, was it at William Turnbull's?
Mm-hmm.
The origin, the nature, the duration of those encounters. What was the constellation of circumstances once you arrived here? And why did they influence your work as strongly as you have acknowledged they have?
Well, in '59 I came here and people were, you know, I like New York, I like the atmosphere. People were very friendly, welcoming. I found that I had the opportunity to meet a lot of artists and see their studios. Something I'd rather not done in England, apart from my working for Moore, who is obviously a much older man. He's 80 now, and apart from that, I hadn't really had the same contact. When I met Ken in Washington, and then later in New York, I was amazed really I saw his show at French and Company, and I liked it very much, even though I wasn't into abstract work. Actually, there were circles, his first circle show, and or second, I think it was his first. And in fact, I found an extraordinary kind of understanding in him of the sort of problems that I'd encountered in London with a young artist. I felt, for example, in London, that because I wasn't particularly verbal, that I wasn't particularly good at being able to explain my work, nor was I able to write surrealist poetry and give a lecture with images and words and things. I mean, there was a lot of this going on, and I felt, well, maybe this, you know, I'm not really being a proper artist, you know. And here was Ken, who was by, you know, the evidence of my eyes, he was a proper artist, because I could see that I thought his work was terrific, and here he was just as dumb as me, and that was nice. That was very rewarding, you know, to feel that I wasn't alone in the world. And I think in some funny way, when I went back, that sustained me a great deal. He also said certain things to me about his way of working, which I felt I could translate into sculpture. He told me that he painted pictures flat on the floor, and he painted them on horses. He painted them, in fact, in ways so that he couldn't see them up like that, and keep on making adjustments, keep on making, saying, I don't think that's quite right, maybe we should move that over a bit. Mm-hmm. You know, he was painting more from an unseen or uncompletely seen thing, so that he could kind of get it right in his right, i.e. right in his mind, not right in what he knew art ought to look like. And so when I got back, I had a little garage, one-car garage, which I'd always worked in. And
behind your house?
Yeah, beside my house. And in fact, I got these large pieces of steel which were really too big to see easily inside this small space, and I worked with them. And I did try to work on one absolutely flat on the ground and then stand up, which was the way that David Smith worked. And but I didn't find that was practically very suitable. But however, I did find that, you know, I could get things into this small, tight space, and somehow I couldn't see them really what they were like. So when they did finally get finished, and, you know, a friend would come and help me make them, we'd move the things out into the courtyard, I got a surprise, and there was some sort of discovery. Once or twice I did it the other way, and moved things out before they were finished, and then I started to make these adjustments all the time. So I didn't think that was a good thing to do. Then I also met here David Smith, and I saw a little of his work. I didn't go to Bolton Landing then. I didn't go till '63 to Bolton Landing, see, you know, the vast quantity of his work. But we met and talked and went around Chinatown together and so on. You know, I had a nice time. It was very nice to me. I mean, you know, I was a lot younger than him, and he never wanted to talk about art, though. He didn't want to talk about art. He talked about anything but art.
Not at all?
Well, not to me.
That's unfortunate.
And of course, you know, Motherwell and Frankenthaler and Ray Parker and Greenberg, and then I went over to San Francisco and around to Mexico City and various other places on that trip, seeing other things. But I think that my main really art experience was in New York then.
And mostly with that Bennington group, too. And
mostly with that group who were at that time not Bennington. You know, it was later, then 3 years later, in '63, Ken telephoned me and said they want a sculptor at Bennington, and I'm living there now. Would you consider coming? And so I said, hold on, and he held on, and I said to my wife, would you like to come to Bennington with the kids? And she said yes, and so I said, yes, okay, we'll come. And so we went.
Among other things that happened to you there, that I assume influenced the future course of your work, was a skiing accent.
Yeah, I did have a skiing accent, yeah.
And I thought it was it a fire station or a garage that you used there as well, on the confines of that space, that caused you to look at your work in a new way again?
Well, when I went to Bennington, actually, which, you know Bennington College for Girls, and it was, there was a lot of art sort of around there. A lot of people were, there was a good art atmosphere. Noland had just come to live up there. He didn't actually teach in the college, but Paul Feely taught there, and Jules Zalitsky came and taught the same term as I did, started. David Smith, I was a little late in coming because I had to put on an exhibition in London, and David Smith set up, he lived only 90 miles away, and he set up the welding shop there, and for the kids. And then there were a lot of visitors used to come every weekend, and it was a tremendously nice atmosphere, a lot of talk about art and a lot of good times and so on. And Noland and Zalitsky, said, well, you got to make sculpture. And I said, no, I'm only here for a limited time. I wasn't sure how limited. And I said, I didn't want to make sculpture. I wanted to have a good time. But they continued to kind of try and press me towards making sculpture. Misplaced competition, I'm sure it was, just like ping pong. And then, in fact, I learned to ski, which I had never done before. And when I broke my leg, then I started making sculpture. I don't know how it happened that way around, but it did. And I worked in the fire station there, which was a larger space, and I was able to put my work out afterwards. And I think I learned a great deal from those two particular artists, Ken and Jules.
How does the influence of a critic like Greenberg resemble and differ from the influence of another artist such as Noland or Zalitsky?
That's a very good question. And it's hard to put your finger on. I think that I watch Noland and Zalitsky out of the corner of my eye. And I think in a way what I'm doing is I'm trying to sort of see them in this kind of competitive sense, like two tennis players might be paying attention to how the other tennis player was playing his match. You know, they might be watching like, one guy might be watching another guy playing in the match and getting to see, where his weaknesses were and where his strengths were. Not because he wanted to better him necessarily, because he could learn from him in terms of making art and in terms of his art life, really. Now, I don't think that is true about either of the two critics who I find the most exciting critics around, which are Clement Greenberg and Michael Fried. In a sense, and they're very different. Greenberg is very specific, and he will actually say, Like I always say, he's got the fastest eye in the West. And he comes in, he'll make a sharp kind of decision and say, that's right, but that piece there is unnecessary. Or why not leave that on, or something? And he will say...
In terms of the construction itself,
in terms of the
to
actual
the color.
object. You know, he will say, yeah. I mean, he will actually sort of say, I like that piece, but I think that that's not necessary. Or, you know, you always leave these ends on. That's an extra end. You know, something like that. And that, you know, I don't accept it every time, but I mean, I find that if I have, you know, I'll go through dozens of sculptures with him, and just put with a bit of chalk on what his comment was. And later I'll go back, and I'll very often find that he's kind of clarified the sculpture. He's made it more itself. Do
you liken his role to that of an editor for you?
I don't know what an editor does. But I mean, he doesn't do it. I live in England. He doesn't often, you know, I often don't get a chance to see him from one year to the next. But when he does come in the studio, I don't want to be out of town. I want to be in town. I want to make sure that he comes in and that he has a look at what I've done, because I'm going to make, I'm going to get a whole, like a whole new thing. It's like somebody tasting your cooking, you know, something like that. Something of that sort. But what Michael Fried will do is rather different from that. You know, I think I can say to Michael, I'm thinking, I've got a whole idea about, you know, maybe sculpture could hang from the ceiling. You know, what do you think about the idea of sculpture? I mean, I haven't sculpture hanging, but what do you think about, you know, putting sculpture in a whole new kind of thing? And he'll say, well, yeah, that's an idea, but you know, maybe it should hang from the wall or something. I mean, I don't know what, but he will almost talk as theoretically, in a sense.
The devil's advocate role?
No.
The art historical role?
No. I haven't explained it right. I can give an example of how Michael Fried was helpful to me. There was a time I was making a lot of sculptures that ran along the floor and seemed to be, you know, too much ground hugging, and I felt that because I had been keen that sculpture should not be in a different world from us and should not be stuck up on a pedestal, separated from us. That I ought to try and make it more real, put it on the floor. And then I got fed up with that, and I thought. Because I saw it, not only was I doing it, but lots of people began doing it, and it kind of became almost as much of an assumption and a boring thing as these sculptures that were on pedestals.
So much has been made of the relationship of your work to the ground itself, where the floor is really part of the sculpture. And that obviously was, among other things, emulated by many of the students that you worked with.
And, right. And then it seemed to me that maybe if that was an assumption, then one should think about putting sculpture on a table. And so I remember that I was struggling with the idea of making a little sculpture that would sit on the table. And
you did do that.
And when I was, and Michael visited me, and I said, I'm struggling with this thing, a sculpture on a table. You know, how can I make it not look like a model? You know, how is it that these things I've done already look a bit like
size
model?
That did not look like maquettes.
And he said, well, think about what is special about a table. What's special about a table? And it was he who pointed out the table's got an edge, so you've got to kind of, you know, you could establish the edge as an important part of the sculpture. And also that things on tables, like cups and saucers, not saucers, cups and pitchers and things like that, have got handles. So, you know, would you consider maybe using handles? And, you know, as soon as he said handles and edge, I was able to start making, you know, I mean, it was he who was able to he was able to do that sort of thing, rather. I don't think that's the way that Clem works. I don't think that's the way that Ken or Jules would stimulate one.
How would Ken and Jules react to any? Can you be specific about any of their reactions to your work or their suggestions?
Yes, I mean, Ken once said to me, "What you know?" When I first went to Bennington, Ken said, "What do you put it all into one sculpture for? You know, you're like you're investing everything in one sculpture, and you make 5 a year or 4 a year. You know, why don't you make a series?" That's the way that Ken would. I thought that was very. There was a lot to learn from that. I thought it was a very good.
Isn't that one part of the Firehouse experience,
Yes,
where you at last started to work in a series,
right,
and explore a specific idea?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, and Jules, I said, "Well, what are you trying to do in your work?" You know, Jules said, "I'm trying to go naked. I'm trying to make it more empty or something." And you know, again, you'd pick up on that sort of thing. I think that's the difference.
You've said that you've never painted a picture in your life. Do you ever do sketches or drawings for your sculpture?
I said that when we last met, I'd never painted a picture.
And well, since then?
I've tried to mess around a little bit with paper and kind of drawings, but coloured drawings on paper this last summer. And they're pretty awful. But I might come through to doing something. It's fun to try, and I have an opportunity to work here. Actually, Helen Frankenthaler said, you know, whenever I want, I can come and paint in her studio, because she made sculpture in my studio one time, and I would like to try it. But I do realize it's quite difficult. I mean, I think it's a little more difficult than I thought it was.
Do you ever do drawings or sketches for your sculpture, or is it really this intuitive, improvisational activity?
Yeah, it's all that.
Can you describe that for us? It's often said that you don't work from a blueprint or in the heat of inspiration, with a kind of cautious and, I guess, thoughtful intuition.
Oh, certainly not.
Then you describe it for us.
No. I can't really. I mean, it's impossible to describe how you act. It's like, you know, I don't think, you know, well, what I will say is this, that I think that I was cautious and thoughtful when I was moving very heavy lumps of steel about myself entirely. In fact, in the old days, I remember sitting for hours and just, you know, wondering whether it was worth it to move this big bit of steel. And I think that's not cautious so much as lazy. But what I've found is that I work different ways. And sometimes I do look and kind of, you know, spend a lot of time looking at one thing and trying to bear down on that one thing and get it right. Sometimes I have several things all around, and I flip nervously from one to the other. Sometimes when I'm working with somebody, because I've been very fortunate, and I've had other sculptors who've been kind enough to help me, and I've had crane drivers and welders and people. I learn a lot from them and their either their approach to sculpture or their approach to heavy material, and I try and go with that a bit. I think what I do most really is kind of is use people as a sounding board in some way. I find very much that having other people to watch and to look at and to pick up from is helpful.
You've had a very unconventional training by your own description. Before your academic art school, you were a student at Charterhouse, I guess the kind of career that prepares one for work in the city, the financial district. And you majored in engineering. Firstly, do you think that engineering background in any way has influenced your work?
Not at all. Not at all, no. You say I majored, but I say I flunked. Anyway, I mean, you know, that was okay. I just, I didn't like it. And it never meant anything to me. I never really had any understanding of it or interest in it. And it was, a lot of it was mathematical and boring as anything.
By the time you were 17, not only your father, but your art teacher told you to be a stockbroker. What
That's
permitted
right.
you to sustain, I mean, how did you sustain yourself and commit yourself to a career in art? In fact, I suspect it wasn't until you were well over the age of 30 that the course of your career really began to form itself.
Well, I think I was very pig-headed at the beginning, and I just was going to do it, and that's all there was to it. And I think that was true. I think that since I got married, I have been incredibly fortunate in marrying somebody who believed in my art and took a great deal of interest in it, and has always been my most assiduous critic, and also, I mean, I'll ask my wife to come in and look at my sculpture, and we might have had a row or anything, but she will still tell me the truth. Reluctantly, if it's good, if we had a row, but she still will tell me, you know, I know I can always expect to have the truth from her. And I think that you cannot work completely alone. I think if you work completely alone, you really do begin to kind of mistrust yourself. I think you can't even work completely isolated in a place like London. And I think that that's why I make a habit of coming to New York. It shakes up my eyes tremendously to see an awful lot of different sort of work, and see, go around the galleries or go around the studios and things. It's very exciting. I don't know what sustains one to just keep on with something. I think you like it, and I think that you like it enough because you don't think you could do anything else as well or with as much pleasure. And you've only got one life, so you might as well enjoy it.
You've been working as a sculptor for almost 35 years now.
Have I really?
Yes. You mentioned before that you worked for about 2 years with Henry Moore, who even at that time was a distinguished figure. Take a moment for what you described as the social detail. Tell us how you got that job.
Oh, just that I felt that I wasn't getting enough. I was still at the academy school, and I wasn't getting really enough from the teachers there, and I decided I'd go and ask Henry Moore if I could work for him. And
did you know him?
I didn't know him at all, and I just went there and came up to his door and said,
there is about 2 hours from where you live.
yes, it was about 2 hours away, and said, can I work for you? And he said, I don't know anything about you. You might have telephoned. And anyway, then he asked me in and gave me tea, and he was very kind. And then he said, well, come back, you know, in 6 months' time you telephone. And he showed me all. He said, we're building a foundry. 6 months' time you telephone, maybe I'll give you a job. And I did. I telephoned him in 6 months exactly, I think. And he gave me a job. I think you're rather brazen when you're determined in some sort of way. And I
maybe innocent too.
Maybe. I think that when I first went to get a show, I did very much the same. And I mean, I went. I had been to 2 or 3 galleries and said, "Would you give me a show?" And they said that they were, you know, they weren't interested. And finally, I went to one gallery, and I said, I was getting a little desperate. This was in London. Will you give me a show? And she said, I don't know anything about you. And so I said, well, now's your chance to learn. So that took her back a little bit. And then she said, well, I said, will you come up on Monday? She said, no, but I come up on Wednesday or something. At that time I had a little car, it was a very old car. And so I was due to meet her at 11:30 or what it was, so the right amount of time beforehand. I got into the car, and of course it wouldn't start, you know how they weren't? And so I hurried up and I rang up the local garage and I got a hire car down there. And when I arrived in the garage, she said, you're late. I said, yes, my car broke down, but I got a hire car outside. Oh, she said, we better go then, come on. So then we went and had a look at the sculpture and so on.
Did she give you a show?
No, she didn't give me a show.
Then we won't mention her name. In 1960, you published a newspaper article that declared that Moore's contributions were now a matter of history, and that the future for sculpture lay in new directions. What was the reaction to that article, and what was its genesis?
I didn't know I did that, but still, I don't think one should really, I think that, I think I was just reacting against the older generation, and I think that there's no harm in it. And I think that I wish that I would like to see some intelligent reaction against the sort of work that I make too, you know. I think that I had that I was a little fed up with the sort of carving and casting that I saw around everywhere, and of course I hadn't seen anything of David Smith, and I was teaching at that time, and I felt, I think, I remember saying to my students, you know, let's try and, you know, anything physical can be sculpture, anything can be sculpture. Unfortunately...
These were students at St. Martin's?
Yes, and many of them, I'm afraid, or some of them, later went out and took it more literally than I meant, and said that when they were walking about there could be sculpture and so on, which I don't think is sculpture. I mean, the very conceptual. But in fact, what I really meant, and some of the experimental classes that we did were less based on the sort of traditional training and the sort of traditional approach that that I had been involved with, such as figures and the mother and child relationship and so on. I mean, the sort of thing which is now very run-of-the-mill, and in fact David Smith had done things which I didn't know about, would be to say, okay, this school is on Charing Cross Road, make a sculpture of Charing Cross Road, you know, or okay, now for the next 2 hours I want you all to go and get straw and boxes or whatever it was, and make a sculpture of that, or let's make a sculpture called a yell, or you know, I mean, in those days, I mean, these things are very much more thing, but those days that was a little bit unusual.
But even then, your work was considered of a more advanced nature, even as compared to David Smith, who I guess was the last hero figure of that medium. And they were referring to your example of what was called horizontality, the horizontality of your work. Work that replaced the totemic, the piled vertical on base system. Can you tell us the evolution of that mode of construction of the horizontality of your work?
Well, you used the word landscape at the beginning, and that is something I very much don't think it is. You know, I related to landscapes. I always felt that David's work had a kind of figurative feel about it because of its horizontality. You know, you use totem and figure and so on. It's kind of a standing person in a sort of way.
Doesn't your work relate to gravity and to the ground?
Yes, I suppose
I'm using it in contrast to the fact that I assume you and others think that your work really does not support a close confrontation with the landscape. But I'm thinking of it really as its relationship to the ground itself.
I'm not following you, I'm sorry.
Well, let me try another example. There are even those who have said that your work sometimes requires a particular kind of setting, ranging from space and isolation to perhaps even the setting of an English garden. Do you create with a specific setting in mind?
No, and I don't like it in English gardens. And nor do English people, I think. I like it in the Emery Gallery. I like it in an anonymous space. I don't create it with anything in mind like that. No, I just want to make it work in a way. I could imagine creating it with a space in mind, and I have made one sculpture that is particularly for a space. But normally, I just want it to work in a way, and then in a sense, what you have to do is to find the place it works best.
Is there any particular setting that you seek for or find most appropriate for your work, other than that neutral space?
No, it's very much like, and I've said this before, it's very much like writing a piece of music. And really, it can be played almost anywhere. You know, if you write a sonata or a string quartet, it can be played in a great many places that are not wrong. But some places are utterly wrong, obviously. I think there are some places that are utterly wrong for my sort of sculpture. But there are an awful lot of places that are okay for it.
For example, the right ones, that is.
Well, places where you can look at it quietly, like in a fairly white room, not a cold clinical room necessarily, but in a fairly anonymous room, or in a room where people live even, where it gets a chance to kind of to be there and to be seen, or in a courtyard which is kind of fairly anonymous. And I'm constantly surprised by seeing sculptures of mine looking nice in courtyards or something, or in somebody's garden, whereas another place I might see it and say, oh my goodness, it's so awful there. You know, I had to put a lot of sculpture, I had to store a lot of my sculpture in a field. It looked horrible. They looked like a lot of little lumps. But I don't, you know, but then those same sculptures were, one of them or two of them were removed into somebody's courtyard and looked fine. So, you know, I think I think it's very much a thing of saying, that's what I don't like and that's what I do like. You wouldn't want to play the piano or a string quartet or something like that, where there were cars rushing by, and it's rather like that. One's actually getting an awful lot of other visual kind of things breaking in on you in a place where the landscape is very overwhelming, say.
Was the work that you created for a particular space the commission for the new East building of the National Gallery?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that commission?
Yes, I'd never worked for a commission before. I'd never actually made anything before that I hadn't made just for fun, and in my studio, and hope for the best. And this time, the architect came to me and said, would I that he had a space in this building which was really like a niche. It was a niche about 14 feet up above a doorway. And he would like to put a bit of sculpture of mine there, rather like a table sculpture, sort of hanging over the edge. And I made as many difficulties as possible and conditions and things to make it quite impossible for him to say yes. But he met all the conditions, and so I was trapped. The sort of conditions I made was I said that I couldn't show anything to a committee, I wouldn't work with a committee, I wouldn't work to a maquette or sketch. I must make the work in the place, on the site. I must be allowed to change my mind totally from anything that I had thought about in the first place. Well, those are very crazy things to ask when somebody is going to take a large chance and put a sculpture up and spend money and so on. And he said okay to all of those things. So I had to go ahead. And it was most unpleasant experience, really, because it was like I made it. First of all, I did make I made a quarter-size model, which was quite big, with all the figures. People were about this size on it, and little cut-out people. And then I worked with that to try and see the sort of steel I wanted to use, and I got an idea of what wouldn't work there and what would. And then I went actually into the building, which was nearly completed, with a couple of workmen and another sculptor who was helping me, Jim Wolfe, and a lifting device on a forklift truck. And we proceeded to make the sculpture there and then. I started it, it went up one way. I decided it was all wrong. I cut it half down. I got it into a complete mess. All the carpenters said, oh dear, I wish you'd left it like it was. It was great. And the curator would come by and pretend to be reading books and seeing how you're getting on. It was like working in public without any clothes on. And I don't think that it's a good, I think it's a good way, I think it was the right way to work there, because I did really get the scale, I think, in the end right. And I did get the feel, because there were a lot of different heights you could see it from. I don't know whether you've seen the building, but in fact, the distances were so great that we had to use walkie-talkies to be able to say, you know, move that, and so on. Also, to move a piece of steel, which you think looks like a, you know, you just lift it up yourselves on the ground, but to move that piece of steel up 14 feet to the ground and then up another 10 feet, you'd have to secure it so well, and all that took so much time that I'd kind of lose my impetus, so that by the time that piece of steel had got halfway up, I'd say, oh no, it's wrong, take it down again, change it, because they were making it sure that nothing fell and so on. So, you know, it was very, in the end I got a better kind of time thing, which was to go and, you know, to make a decision to put that piece of steel up and then go away and have a cup of coffee and then come back and see what it looked like. You know, meant a lot of coffees during the day.
The color of that piece is white.
No, grey and steel. Different greys and just steel. It's a plain, the steel was left. The steel was left as it was, with a very light rust-proof primer on it, rust-proof varnish on it. But parts of it are grey.
How do you decide what color to paint the surface of your pieces? There was a brown period and a yellow period.
Not really.
You didn't like the yellow?
No, I get my wife to do that. No, there wasn't a brown and yellow period. No, there were brown sculptures, yellow sculptures. And
how do you decide?
Well, there was a time that I used to paint all the color, all my sculptures, certain colors. So that's going to be a red sculpture, and then it looked wrong red, and I'd paint it green, and I'd change it. And then I got fed up with color. I found I found actually that I got more interested in whether it was shiny or matte. And then I started to use rather decorative steel with curly ends. And I felt that couldn't take any color. I felt I just had to leave it as steel, and I varnished that. And in this last show, in the show this show,
the Lake sculpture.
Yes, I've actually painted parts, some parts, the same way as I've done it at the National Gallery piece. Really, almost to accentuate the steel, not to kind of unsteel it, you know what I mean?
In your conversations with Clement Greenberg, who certainly has shown a devotion to the unpainted surface in the most recent period, has he expressed that same idea in the surface of your work? Would you prefer it be painted or unpainted? And has that influenced you?
Oh, no, you're talking about the whole...
David Smith, yeah.
Yeah. The David Smith thing, I don't think, you know, I think that should, I would prefer not, I'd like to answer that question, but I don't want to put it on the tape thing, because I think it's such a trivial thing, the whole thing, and it's been blown up into something such, so scandalous and so wrong and so stupid.
Would you like to defend it?
Absolutely.
Would
I'd
you?
very much like to defend it, but I wouldn't think that in a year or 2 years anybody's going to give a damn. You know? But do you want me to defend it? Certainly I will. In fact, I think, I think the way that you put it was snide.
I did not mean it that way. What I was doing was pointing out that at a very similar time to the time that, by his own description, Mr. Greenberg was unpainting the surfaces of Mr. Smith's work. In a similar period, you had returned to unpainted surfaces as well, and since I know you had exchanges with Mr. Greenberg, I wondered if that influenced you. And that was meant as a direct question rather than an inference.
Okay. No, I wasn't. I don't think I was influenced particularly by that in any way. But let me defend the Greenberg removal of paint on Smith's sculpture, because it always comes up actually when there's when 2 or 3 gather together and we start talking like this, and I think it is. Do you all know the story about what happened?
Why don't you tell?
Would you tell them the story? Well, go ahead. Tell them the story.
Very briefly, long after the death of Mr. Smith, Mr. Greenberg, the executor of his estate and his close associate, chose to remove the painted surfaces from a number of sculptures that David Smith created. Is that simply, briefly stated correct?
It's stated right. It was also, it appeared in an art magazine with an article. Rosalind Krauss wrote this article saying, here is this terrible scandal that's happened.
Actually, numbers of persons.
No, the first person was Rosalind
She was
Krauss.
The first person,
Yeah.
But after that,
and
numbers
then
of
it blew
persons
up. Time magazine
that.
picked it up a lot. And so what actually happened was that there were some painted pieces, but David Smith actually used to put a great many coats on his work. He didn't just put one coat on, because he took a great pride in it. He would put, he told me sometimes he put as many as 27 coats on a piece of sculpture. And these pieces that the paint was taken off had white priming coat on. That's all. It was the primer. And David Smith hadn't decided what color they were going to be. He hadn't, in fact, you could call them unfinished works.
So you're saying rather than a painted piece, this was the primer that we were seeing.
Primer is what we were seeing. We were seeing sculptures white. David Smith, I'm sure, would never have left them white. Now, that was the first thing. The second thing is that David Smith trusted Greenberg. He trusted his eye. He said to me, I have one critic, and that's Clement Greenberg. He said those words to me. And we call executors in England trustees. Do you hear? And I think it's rather nice in a way, because it means they're people who you trust. And David Smith trusted Clement Greenberg, and David Smith was dead. I don't think it's likely that he would have done something that was wholly against the spirit of Smith's sculpture. And I think when sculptors die, when any artist dies, an awful lot of funny things happen. When Titian died, Titian used to paint, and he'd paint on a number of things, as many as maybe 50 at different times, and he would turn them to the wall, and then he'd pull one out and look at it and go on painting it. And when he died, there were, say, 50 or I don't know how many paintings in his studio. Now, nobody ever knew which ones were finished and which ones weren't. But they're all out in all the museums, and I bet you one or two of them, I know one in the National Gallery in England, that I'll bet you is not finished, because it's no good. And Titian was good. So, they're going out as finished Titians. And when sculptors die, the widows, get things cast. Gonzalez's widow had work that was made in steel, cast in bronze. An awful lot of things happen because there's nobody to say, that's what I want. And here is Greenberg, who was one of 3 trustees, who took upon himself, and I think with great dedication and responsibility. He said, I'm going to really look after Smith's estate. And he did. And the other trustees or executors weren't very diligent. And he made this choice that these sculptures were not finished. They had white priming paint on them. He didn't know what color David would have painted them. So he said, well, if we want to preserve them as finished pieces, it's better at least to go back to where they were left for as certain, like the sculptural part's been done on them.
How does your work relate to what's being done in England at this time?
Well, I think there's some good sculpture being made in England. I think that
a number of your former students are making some of it.
I think there's good sculpture being made all over, as a matter of fact. I think there's a lot of good sculpture happening in the world now. And in fact, I think the hope, I'd like to think the hope for sculpture is very good. Because I think that in a way, it's as if it's opening up a little bit. And I think in painting, it's more difficult. Painters seem to be, a little bit more in a corner somehow. So I think that there are some good people. How it relates is that I think that some of the young sculptors who I think are going to be good are reacting strongly against me, just like I reacted against Moore or Smith. And but I see a lot of sculpture I like, both here and in Canada, a certain amount in Australia.
In your most recent work, you created it, in fact, in Canada, as I recall, yes. In Saskatchewan. How did that come about? What is Emma Lake? Where is Emma Lake?
Emma Lake's a lovely place. It's there's a lake up there in the woods, And the University of Saskatoon of Saskatchewan at Saskatoon, they have a kind of summer camp up there. There's a central cafeteria where you eat, and there are little cabins where you live, and if you want to work, you can work, and if you don't want to work, you can go out in a canoe, but there's nothing else to do. I mean, really nothing.
So you work a great deal.
So you work, and also the meals were at funny times, like at 8 o'clock in the morning, breakfast, and if you were there later than 10 past 8, you missed it. So I was thinking, so 8 o'clock breakfast, 12 o'clock lunch, 5 o'clock dinner, and that's it. And so after 5 o'clock, you know, you've got to go back to work. There's nothing else to do. So I worked, you know, long days. And
how many works did you create there?
Well, I didn't work alone. I was very lucky. I had Doug Bentham, who's a sculptor from Saskatoon, who was incredibly helpful, and he had a truck with a crane on it. No, with a crane on it actually. And he went, and he was willing to work just as long and as hard or harder than I would. And so it was great. We kind of spurred each other on, and we gave each other ideas. It was very good. Well, he gave me ideas. I had a very good time there.
You like working in collaboration?
Yeah, love it, love it. I don't believe that sculpture is, I don't believe that art is, art isn't the possession of anybody, of any artist. Art is something that, you know, we're lucky if we are able to receive some of it out of the air and put it into form or something. You know, maybe we aren't, maybe we just kind of are receivers, wireless receivers or something.
What would you like to be doing 10 years from now?
Making sculpture, not sitting up on a podium.
Well, you were very generous to come this evening to tell us so freely of your life and your work. Thank you very much, Anthony Caro, for being with us. Now, we would like to ask the class to join in the conversation. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and if you care to,